The U.S. has announced its intention to pull out of a key nuclear weapons treaty, and it is blaming Russia. The pact is called the Intermediate Range Nuclear Force, or INF Treaty. Washington has been a signatory since 1987, and now there's concern a pullout could lead to a new arms race. CBC's Lindsay Duncombe is on the story in Washington.
Well, because the U.S. has long said that Russia is in violation of this treaty with the development of specific weapons systems. Here's what Mike Pompeo had to say at the State Department today.
Russia's violation puts millions of Europeans and Americans at greater risk. It aims to put the United States at a military disadvantage, and it undercuts the chances of moving our bilateral relationship in a better direction. It's our duty to respond appropriately.
The president followed up that announcement shortly with a statement. Here's what he said. We cannot be the only country in the world unilaterally bound by this treaty or any other. We will move forward with developing our own military response options, and will work with NATO and other allies and partners to deny Russia any military advantage from its unlawful conduct. And shortly after the announcement was made in the United States, NATO also said that it believes that the U.S. is right, that Russia is violating the treaty, and it supports the American action. What the announcement today does is really start a 6-month clock. And if 6 months goes by and there are no new talks or no new compliance, then what that means is that the treaty is essentially done. And the idea that that would happen seems very unlikely to many people because of how dug in both Washington and Moscow are.
That's CBC's Lindsay Duncombe in Washington. With more on what all of this means and whether we are headed to Cold War Part 2, I'm joined by nuclear weapons policy expert Joe Cirincione. Joe is the president of Plowshares Fund. That is a global security foundation, and we reached him in Washington. Joe, great to have you on the program. Want to get right into it. How important is this treaty, not just for the U.S., not just for Russia, but for the rest of the world?
This treaty is historically important. When Ronald Reagan negotiated it with Mikhail Gorbachev, it broke the back of the nuclear arms race. This was the first reduction treaty. The Soviet Union and the United States destroyed over 3,000 perfectly good nuclear weapons that they had spent billions of dollars building. They destroyed them and banned them globally. It really started the process of nuclear reductions that has gone on for over 30 years to this day. It's important now because it continues that ban on these weapons. And the hope has always been that you could get other countries like China, like India, to eventually join in this ban. The U.S. killing this treaty now is a major blow to the nuclear security safety net that we've constructed over the decades. And the fear is that it will lead to even more unraveling, particularly with the new START treaty that has constrained Russia and the United States' strategic long-range forces.
You brought up a good point. China, India, nuclear-armed countries. What message does it send to those two?
That the gentlemen, start your engines. You know, both of those countries have missiles of this range, and now it tells them that the United States and Russia are going to try to build new ones. There is a real problem. When I was an advisor to the State Department, I saw the data on the Russian test of this missile. I agree, they are almost certainly in violation. But when someone breaks the law, you don't repeal the law. The trick is to get them back into compliance. When Ronald Reagan was negotiating this treaty in the late 1980s, Russia was in violation of the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, the ABM Treaty. He didn't kill the treaty. He worked to get them back in compliance, which he eventually did after 8 years. So that's the path that our NATO allies would like us to pursue. The NATO allies are very worried
Joe,
that this could need a break.
Let me jump in here. To give Washington its due, it's not killing the treaty. It's Saturday, tomorrow, the clock will start on 180 days as to whether the U.S. does, negate this and it pulls out. So there's 6 months in which to find perhaps a different punishment. Is that the right term?
That's a different diplomatic solution, and there are multiple ways you can fix this. But that's exactly right, and that's why you're hearing these statements come out of NATO. They want to show solidarity at the highest level, even though their governments are privately freaking out over this.
Yep.
For example, look at the statements from the European Union foreign spokesperson, much more concerned about the U.S. action, and they're hoping that the U.S. and Russia can be coaxed back into a negotiation. Right now, the United States is demanding that Russia destroy these missiles. Russia is offering visual inspection of the missiles. That is the kind of step the U.S. should accept. So it's somewhat of concern that the U.S. is such a hardline position, and it fuels suspicion that the point is to kill the treaty, not really to get Russia into compliance. John Bolton, the national security advisor, has hated this treaty ever since Ronald Reagan negotiated it. He may have succeeded in killing it. We got 6 months to stop him from putting in the knife.
The European allies, you mentioned, they're on edge. That's only going to increase as that clock continues towards that end of the 180 days. How is it going to try to coax the United States to rethink?
Well, in their previous statements and in the previous consultations, and I've heard this from some of the diplomats involved, they've been trying to get the United States to engage in a serious negotiation with Russia. So you heard the statistic, for example, today that the U.S. 35 times tried to get Russia to comply. That's a lot of puffery. There weren't that many serious efforts. In fact, the very last one that the U.S. Undersecretary of State took was really the U.S. going there presenting this demand: destroy the missiles. That's all we're going to talk about. That is a very unreasonable demand. So finally got to put this in context. What the Europeans are seeing, and the Canadians and the rest of the world, is this is yet another international agreement that the Trump administration is pulling out of. The Paris Climate Accord, Trans-Pacific Partnership, the anti-nuclear deal with Iran, and now this. So you're seeing a sort of ideological approach to international agreements that really puts America first and discredits these kind of multilateral arrangements that most of the world bases their security on. That's what has our allies so jittery.
You know, I think we could have a whole other show on whether this really does put America first and what the rest of the world is thinking as it looks at some of those situations you mentioned in which America is pulling out of treaties and negotiated settlements. But for you personally, you've got eyes on this, you know, from Washington. What are you going to be watching for in the months ahead?
Will the State Department engage in good faith negotiations with Russia? Now, my view is that both of the parties are to blame. Russia for violating this in the first place and for not doing enough to fix it when they had the chance over the past 4 years now, since we detected the violation. Russia should have done more. I think the U.S. position is hardline. I'll be looking for some flexibility. Will they have at least an inspection of the missiles? Will they propose other solutions to this? One thing that might encourage the U.S. is not the allies, it's what the U.S. Congress is doing. Just yesterday, 10 U.S. senators led by Senator Jeffrey Merkley, including, by the way, 6 potential presidential candidates, introduced legislation to bar funding for any U.S. missiles that would violate this treaty. You can expect the House of Representatives to support that. The Trump administration is going to have a hard time getting money for its part of the nuclear arms race.
Great to talk to you, Joe. Appreciate your time. You have a great day.
Thank you very much for having me on.
Joe Cirincione is a nuclear weapons policy expert. We reached him in Washington. So as expected, Russia is slamming that U.S. decision. It accuses the Americans of starting a new arms race. CBC Moscow correspondent Chris Brown is on the story. He joins me live from the Russian capital. Chris, what more is the Kremlin saying?
Well, so Hannah, the Kremlin has had a long time, many weeks, if not months, to sort of prepare its lines for this, and also to set up really who's going to get hit with the blame game in this. But let's go through some of what's been said today, and there have been some pretty strong words. We'll start with the Federation Council on Foreign Affairs Committee. Its chair, Konstantin Kosachev. The U.S. has taken another step today towards destroying the world, he said. From Leonid Slutsky, also a prominent deputy in the Duma, the U.S. has triggered a new arms race, and this will be a serious blow to the international arms control system and the system of non-proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. That from Russia's Deputy Foreign Affairs Minister today. As I say, Russia has seen this coming, almost in a bid to head off some of what the Americans have been saying today. Last week, they invited a number of defense attaches from all around the world out to one of their military installations to show off some of these controversial missiles. They showed them the gas tanks, they showed them the warheads, and they said, look, these are all built and assembled this way in the factory. They can't be changed, and they clearly can't fly beyond the distances that we say they can, so there's nothing to the American claims. Of course, the U.S. State Department not only flatly rejected that assessment, saying, of course, you can tamper with these, and you do all the time. They didn't send any of their defense attaches out to view it, nor did any other NATO country.
And outside of political circles there in Moscow, what concerns are you hearing, Chris?
I think really almost for the last year, 18 months at least, beyond treaties, but really just talking about the overall relationship between Russia and the United States, as there have been diplomatic expulsions and an overall lessening of official contacts and also unofficial contacts between Russia and the United States. You're hearing from groups such as the Carnegie Center here that they're quite worried that back in the Cold War, there was often a lot of talking, and so that people could kind of see what's coming up and they kind of understood the other side better. And without those official and unofficial contacts, there's room for mistakes. So the Carnegie Institute calls those things almost unofficial guardrails, and they see a lot of those guardrails that basically prevented accidents, prevented war from being in jeopardy.
Thanks for that, Chris. We'll talk again. CBC's Chris Brown. He is in Moscow.